Hi everyone. Hi. Thank you guys so much for coming here today. My name is Ohanyan. I am co-president of the Harvard Armenian Students Association along with Mary Galliston, who's somewhere in the room. So we want to thank you very much, first of all, for finding some time in your week to come to this event. We're super excited to have a lively discussion, and Mark will be introducing our speakers, but first I just wanted to thank some of our co-event hosters and sponsors. So thank you to the Harvard Kennedy School Institute of Politics for providing us with a grant to give the lovely food that we have upstairs. Thank you to Moss's Bakery for giving us that food. Thank you so much to NAASR and also the College Gulesserian Fund for agreeing to co-host this and putting this on. As well as thank you to AGBU Young Professionals of Boston for covering this event and co-hosting with us. Mark will be giving a further description of our speakers and the outline for the night. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for being here. And 1 year ago, just about exactly 1 year ago, extraordinary events took place in Armenia with a corrupt and anti-democratic leadership yielding to popular will and accomplishing at least initial phase of Nikol Pashinyan's so-called Velvet Revolution. 1 year later, the jury is out on many aspects of the new regime, but what transpired there is still remarkable in light of events over the past several years in pretty much everywhere else in the world. So last year, after the initial buzz of the Velvet Revolution had passed, I started to think, and I'm sure others here did, how and why did this happen in Armenia and not elsewhere? And as I've been reading over the past year such important and largely depressing books as Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt's How Democracies Die, Jason Stanley's How Propaganda Works, and Timothy Snyder's The Road to Unfreedom. These are the fun books. And wondering just what the hell has happened to our world, I started to wonder if the case of Armenia gave us any insights or even any hope about what might be possible elsewhere, and at the same time, what can we learn from the depressing apparent decline of democracy and the rise of strongmen and far-right movements around the world, not excluding here in the United States and other countries with strong democratic institutions and traditions. And can we bring some people together to talk about these different aspects of this, which is why we're here tonight. One of the people I discussed this with in the very early stages of planning and who could not be here tonight, unfortunately, is Aisha Kadioglu, who is currently a visiting scholar at Harvard's Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. And even though she's not here, I want to thank her in absentia for her insights and also for connecting us with two of tonight's panelists. I also, likewise, like Chris, want to thank all of the co-sponsoring organizations for coming together to organize the event, and the members of our Contemporary Issues Committee for their input and work, and of course the panelists for making time in their busy schedules to be with us tonight. So I'll now hand things over to Dr. Lisa Gulesserian, lecturer on Armenian in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, who will introduce our panel and moderate tonight's discussion. So thank you again for being here.
So as Mark said, this is a year in the making, this panel right here, as they're sitting and ready to share their expertise with you. I also, like Mark and Chris, would like to thank our event's organizing partners as well as our co-sponsors. It's because of their support and yours that we're all here tonight. Of course, the events in Armenia are also bringing us here together again a year after they happened. But I just wanted to point out that we do have a lot of people here to thank. So I welcome you to tonight's panel discussion, Trend or Exception, Democratization in Armenia and Authoritarianism Worldwide. Tonight's program is the second to be presented at Harvard as part of NAASR's series on contemporary Armenian issues this academic year. Our previous event in September 2018 took stock of the Velvet Revolution in Armenia 6 months after its successful transfer of power. Last fall's event followed almost 5 years of previous programming in the series that included presentations about various precursors and catalysts for the Velvet Revolution. Tonight's event continues NAASR's commitment to covering important topics in today's global Armenian diaspora. Our panel tonight will help us understand Armenia's Velvet Revolution in context. At a time when there is great concern over the apparent decline of liberal democracy around the world, in 2018, Armenia seemed to be a notable exception and was hailed as badly needed good news for democracy by the Washington Post. Our panelists tonight will help us contextualize the dramatic events of last spring in Armenia by talking about democratic backsliding worldwide. If, as scholars of democratic movements have suggested, democracy is a never-ending process, we have much to learn from the wide-ranging expertise of tonight's panelists. To this end, tonight's program will run as follows. Each panelist will be introduced before the panelist delivers a short prepared remark. We'll begin with Valerie Sperling, then move to Dimitri Sotiropoulos, and end the evening with Anna Ohanyan. After each panelist has spoken, I'll begin our Q&A with my questions before opening up the floor to questions from you, our audience. Our program will end at which point we will invite you to join us outside or upstairs for more refreshments. Like you, I'm looking forward to learning from our experts, so let's begin. Our first panelist is Valerie Sperling. Valerie is Professor of Political Science at Clark University. She's the co-author of 2019's Courting Gender Justice, Russia, Turkey, and the European Court of Human Rights, and the author of 2015's Sex, Politics, and Putin, Political Legitimacy in Russia, which won 2 national Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies awards. Sperling teaches a variety of courses in comparative politics, including Russian politics, revolution and political violence, mass murder and genocide under communism, transitions to democracy, globalization and democracy, and, who would have thunk it, political science fiction. So tonight, Valerie will speak about the Russian case of authoritarian backsliding, briefly couching her remarks in the overall trend of authoritarian backsliding worldwide since 2006. Please join me in welcoming Valerie.
Lisa. Is this audible? Can you hear me? Okay, great. So I want to start by pointing out that democratization is not a linear process, and it's also not a process that's ever completed. This is true for particular countries, and it's also true if we take a more global perspective. So if we look a little bit briefly and broadly at the last 50 years of political regime change around the world, for example, you might have cause for optimism, as there have been several waves of sort of dramatic countries beginning their transitions to democracy. So if you think back, this begins with the transition away from fascism in Spain and in Portugal in the mid-70s, and it continued with the termination of right-wing military dictatorships in Latin America in the 1980s. So if you remember Argentina toppling their military junta in 1983, for example, and Chile removing their authoritarian military dictator Augusto Pinochet in 1988 in a popular referendum. So democratic upsurges like that were visible across the globe at that time. So Fernando Marcos, the long-term dictator of the Philippines, he was unseated in 1986, and the apartheid regime in South Africa was replaced by a non-racial, one-person, one-vote democracy in 1994. And more recently, of course, in the Middle East, we saw the Arab Spring in 2011, which gave rise to hopes that even in that part of the world where dictatorship seems most intractable, change is possible. But in all this past 50 years, 1989 might have been the most memorable year for democratization, as that year saw the collapse of Communist Party dictatorships across Eastern Europe, a process that resulted in at the end of 1991 in the Soviet Union itself coming to an end and leaving 15 newly independent states to find their own political paths forward, including Armenia. Now, although a point of democratic consolidation, meaning confidence in a democratic regime, can be reached, there's always the risk of backsliding, and that seems ever more true today. If instead of taking the 50-year view, we take the 20-year view, or even the 10-year view, things look considerably worse with regard to democracy around the world. The U.S. non-governmental organization Freedom House, which collects and analyzes data on democratic indicators like free and fair elections, or the unfettered enjoyment of civil liberties, like freedom of speech and association, or the separation of powers, Freedom House has found that countries' ratings on the democratic spectrum have been steadily declining around the world since 2006. So we are currently experiencing a global retrenchment of democratization. Since 2006, 113 countries have undergone a net decline in their democratic indicators, and only 62 states in that period of time have seen an overall improvement. As of last year, 39% of people in the world were living in countries deemed democratic or free. 24% of the world's population lived in states with only limited democratic elements, what Freedom House calls partly free. And 37% of the globe's citizens were living under authoritarian rule, which is to say, they may have had the form of democracy present in their country, like regular elections, but not the content of democracy, such as, let's say, opposition party candidates having access to television time. So Russia is unfortunately a great illustration of the potential for backsliding and the failure to consolidate democracy. And that's what I'm going to focus on for the remainder of my talk this evening. So Russia's opportunity for democratization really began when it became an independent state at the end of 1991. But as Vladimir Gelman has argued, at almost every juncture where an opportunity arose for Russia's new leaders to make a choice to increase democratic freedom and popular participation, instead they chose to preserve their own power. And this repeated failure to do the right thing unfortunately set Russia on a path back toward authoritarianism pretty early on in the period of Russia's independent statehood. So I'll say a little bit about Russia's transition away from single-party communist dictatorship in broad terms, then I'll get into some more concrete details regarding the status of democratic institutions and practices in Russia today. So Russia's transition from communist dictatorship at best has been a mixed bag. In the 1990s, after 7 decades of Communist Party rule, Russia enjoyed real parliamentary elections with political competition between parties that had actual political programs and constituencies based on those programs. But the democratization process that got started in the early 1990s hit some bumps along the way. And the first big rough patch was October of 1993, when Russia's president at the time, Boris Yeltsin, got into a conflict with Russia's parliament. And what they were in dispute about was the extremely unpleasant effects of moving toward a market economy, what was called shock therapy at the time. And what amounted to freeing prices, letting prices liberalize and rise to whatever level they found, and at the same time dropping state subsidies. So the effect of these two policies together was to leave many people impoverished and unhappy. So Yeltsin solved that conflict by first dissolving the parliament, and then, when the deputies refused to leave the building, Yeltsin ordered the military, the Russian military, to shell the parliament and the parliamentarians inside of it with tanks. Now, without getting into the details, perhaps it would suffice to say that this looked like a terrible decision for Russian democratization. But within 2 months of that unfortunate and very violent episode in the middle of Moscow, Russia voted on a new constitution, held elections for a new parliament, proceeded to hold regular elections for both parliament and the presidency throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, In the 1990s, those elections for parliament regularly included liberal parties, the Communist Party, a fascist party that was confusingly called the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, and a pro-Kremlin party of power whose name changed over time. Since the year 2000, however, those elections have become increasingly less competitive, less pluralist, less free, with the ever more popular winner being the pro-Kremlin party of power, which has been called United Russia ever since Vladimir Putin became president in the year 2000. So starting with the parliamentary elections in 2003, United Russia has won a majority of seats in the Russian parliament, in the Russian Duma, and it's increased to a supermajority of 76% of the seats in the most recent elections in 2016. Now, this electoral success is not because the party United Russia is particularly popular with Russia's citizenry, and not because it has some kind of policy stances that are particularly embraced by the population, but rather because the party itself is a vehicle for power and for political careers, and those in power want to stay in power. United Russia is also helped considerably by widespread application of the techniques of electoral fraud, such as ballot box stuffing, such as factory bosses and university administrators insisting that their workers and students go and vote and then take pictures of their ballot to show that they voted to support the Kremlin's party, United Russia. Fraud takes the form of busing voters around to multiple voting sites so that they can demonstrate their loyalty to the Kremlin by voting repeatedly for United Russia. So that's the parliamentary elections. What we've seen is sort of an increasing decline of democracy over time. We can also see some early anti-democratic phenomena in the trajectory of Russia's presidential elections. In 1991, Boris Yeltsin was elected president of Russia back when it was still part of the Soviet Union. In 1996, he was re-elected, but his main opponent at that time, a Communist Party leader, was uncomfortably popular, so much so that in the first round of the elections, nobody got a majority. And at that point, the wealthy owners of Russia's media companies teamed up with Yeltsin to do their best to exclude the Communist Party candidate from the television arena, and also to mask Yeltsin's flaws, such as his declining health. And these oligarchs, as they were called, were richly rewarded for their efforts with ownership of Russia's natural resource companies. Russia's presidential elections continued to feature undemocratic elements. So that was 1996. In 1999, at the end of the year, Yeltsin stepped down. He resigned from the presidency, which made his prime minister automatically the acting president. And this was Vladimir Putin, who then benefited from the fact that there could only be 3 months between the president's resignation and the next presidential elections. So Putin handily won in March of 2000 and handily won again 4 years later. And because the Russian Constitution only allows a president 2 terms in a row, in 2008, Putin reached agreement with his hand-picked successor, Dimitri Medvedev, who became the presidential nominee of the Kremlin, and Putin switched places with him, becoming the prime minister, with the understanding that Putin, rather than Medvedev, would actually continue to hold power in the country while Medvedev took on this sort of took on the presidential role with the power behind the throne belonging to Putin. Now, one of Medvedev's first acts as this placeholder president was to sponsor a change to the Constitution that extended the presidential term from 4 years to 6 years. Not for him, of course, but for whoever should come after him, which of course was Vladimir Putin in 2012. So Putin won that year. He won again in 2018. If he serves out this term that he's in, he will have been running the country for a quarter century. What facilitates these victories is the absence of a level playing field for other candidates and political parties. So Putin's most popular opponent across the country is an anti-corruption activist named Alexei Navalny. He was forbidden to run for the Russian presidency in 2018. And after unexpected protests arose across the country following the revelation of widespread electoral fraud in December of 2011, the fines for participating in unsanctioned protests were elevated beyond all reason to discourage all but the hardiest opponents from voicing their discontent publicly on the streets. So these and other restrictions on the freedom of expression and freedom of assembly help maintain the status quo in the country, as does the state's ownership of all of the major television channels, and as does executive branch control of the judiciary and of the governorships across the country. Unfortunately, the regular application of violence against journalists is another aspect of Russia's regime that suppresses critical reporting on political corruption and thereby deprives citizens of a full picture of the regime. And 28 journalists have been killed since Putin came to power in the year 2000. So one of the lessons we can learn from Russia is that democratization is a difficult process. In 1997, Mike McFaul, who at that time was a scholar studying Russia and since that time has served as ambassador to Russia under President Barack Obama, in 1997, McFaul wrote an article about democracy in Russia, concluding that the country had made a definitive shift away from authoritarianism. Russian democracy was not perfect, McFaul wrote, but elections were now, as he put it, the only game in town. In other words, there was no room in 1997 on the political stage in Russia for any would-be dictators or Communist Party insurgents to try to take power in a coup. But if elections were the only game in town in Russia in 1997, 20 years later, elections are unfortunately now the only part of the democratic political game that are left in town. And that is where I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valerie. So what I definitely learned from that is that democratization is a difficult process, continuous process. And we'll be hearing a different context now with our next speaker. So our next speaker is, our second panelist is Dimitri Sotiropoulos. He is professor of political science at the University of Athens. His publications include the edited volumes, 2002's Is Southeastern Europe Doomed to Instability? And 2006's The State and Democracy in the New Southern Europe. This year, Dimitri is a visiting scholar at the Center for European Studies here at Harvard University, where he is focusing on democracies backsliding and democratic innovations in European democracies in the Balkans. Please join me in welcoming Dimitri as he presents his paper centered on Europe that will show how democratic backsliding is a global problem and not one limited to developing countries. Thank you.
Good evening. I would like to thank Mark, Lisa, and Chris for organizing this event. Indeed, I will be talking about a phenomenon we all witness. This is that the world is changing again, and by this I mean that there is a large-scale change in terms of the political regimes. And that is a change that has been taking place, as Valerie has explained, for approximately a decade now. And it is a change that comes after the previous large-scale transformation of political regimes had not been completed. While now we witness what I would like to call a slide away from popular sovereignty, in the past we had the other previous large-scale change, which was a transition towards democracy and also towards the consolidation of democracy. While now elected leaders who soon become authoritarian leaders and populist party leaders, despite what they claim, push democracies downhill, in the past we had the previous large-scale transformation, which was that many countries in Latin America, Southern Europe and Eastern Europe had made a transition from authoritarian or from totalitarian rule. That change was not over, exactly because some of the East European democracies were very fragile, not in the sense that they ever collapsed, but in the sense that democratization became stagnant. And in fact, in Eastern Europe, some of these new democracies started backsliding. While that change has not been completed, this new change away from popular sovereignty is taking place. And we see that in Eastern Europe, political regimes such as democracy in Poland and Hungary today become less and less democratic in the sense that they backslide from what we call procedural democracy, not from substantive democracy. And while Southeast European regimes, such as regimes in the Balkans, had also made some progress towards becoming functioning democracies, they have also become stagnant over the last 10 years, or they have also started backsliding. But why do I make this distinction between procedural and substantive democracies? Because I'm not talking about the democracy each one of us in this room, I suspect, would have in his or her dreams. By substantive democracy, we mean a political regime in which there is widespread political participation, deliberation over policies before they are voted, the possibility of protest that would bring about change in the short run, in the long run, and certainly the means and rules through procedural democracy also works, which is a much narrower concept, including the conduct of free, periodic, fair and open elections, and the rule of law, and certainly trust in democratic political institutions, such as the government, the parliament, and the political parties. Thus, we have not reached a situation in which procedural democracy itself had become consolidated in many of countries of Europe, which were developed economies, and then we saw the process I'm trying to describe as backsliding. Various authors mentioned by Valerie, such as Levitsky and Ziblatt, but also Tilly and also Vermio, have explained that we have a process in which there is no collapse of democracy of the kind we witnessed in Europe just before the Second World War. It is a different kind of process. This is a process in which the executive becomes very strong, overshadowing the legislative and the judicial branch of government. A process in which you also have electoral fraud, and also in other countries, not so much developed economies, you have promissory coup, by which we mean the fact that someone grabs power and promises to reinstate democracy after such a dictator believes that he, usually, not she, will bring order in society. And that, again, is not the typical case, because what we have in terms of backsliding away from procedural democracy is sometimes even more subtle. Thus, we have the following situation. We have, first of all, that society itself sometimes feels ready to accept that such a slide away from popular sovereignty will take place. And why is this so? Why is this so? Because large shares of the electorate feel that they have been left behind, or that for their generation, I'm talking about the younger people, upward social mobility is not as possible as it was for the generations of their parents and grandparents. Or there are other strata in society which have become the losers of large-scale economic changes, such as changes associated with economic globalization. So when there is such a very variable disenchantment with democracy, then democracy itself may become very fragile. What I'm trying to say is that we should not look only at what authoritarian leaders do, but we should also look at whether there is sometimes a receptive social base which has lost its confidence in democracy. Indeed, there is research in political science which says that even in advanced democracies, there is a gradual deconsolidation of the democratic regime, and that research points to the fact that members of the younger generations are less enthusiastic, to put it mildly, than members of the middle age and the old age group with regard to democracy. I think that this indeed is not a case of deconsolidation. That would be indeed a far-fetched argument. However, we do see that there are very hostile movements which are hostile to democracy, political parties which profess very authoritarian policy measures, and such movements or parties do obtain in elections a rather shocking share of the total vote. I refer, of course, to parties which are plainly neo-Nazi parties, fascist parties, authoritarian populist parties, and so on and so forth. While this movement seems to be gaining ground in Eastern Europe, and sometimes also we can see this in Southern Europe, we also have in Eastern Europe a parallel situation. This is the establishment of regimes which we call in political science competitive authoritarian regimes. These are regimes which are not plain democracy, dictatorships, I'm sorry. They are not simple old-fashioned dictatorships. They are based on the fact that, first of all, people sometimes may be receptive to voting for a strong ruler, and this strong ruler, along with a governing party, is able to control the media, the parliament, the justice system, independent authorities, such as the ombudsman, and also to harass dissenting groups, such as social movements from below, from society, and also non-governmental organizations, which sometimes take the place of very fragile political opposition. And if that situation arises, what we have is that the ruling party becomes immensely empowered. This is a situation in which the ruling party, as it has happened, for example, in Hungary, feels comfortable to change the constitution. By changing the constitution, what we have is that the executive is further strengthened at the expense of the other democratic institutions. And what is more, the ruling party is able to capture institutions and also, in association with very strong business interests, to capture whole policy sectors. This is what we call policy capture. So large businesses which are managed by businessmen who are very closely associated with the top officials of the ruling party are able to have legislation which is tailor-made to their interest, passed by parliament. This means that no other businessman can enter a certain niche of the market, for example, in telecommunications or in the energy sector, and thus you have different sectors of the economy in which the ruling party is able also to make policies which are policies that help the promotion of the business interests of those very same businessmen which in turn subsidize the ruling party. This is a situation in which you have then competitive authoritarianism with the worst kind of capitalism. In terms of competitive authoritarianism, you have something much less than procedural democracy. You have elections which, even if they are free, in the sense that different parties can compete for power, they are not fair, for the reasons I mentioned, and they were also explained by Valerie. At the same time, you have a kind of capitalism that emerges in a situation in which, exactly because the large-scale movement I described, the initial transition to democracy had not been completed, this kind of democratization has not brought about the social fruits of democracy. Because, you know, indeed, democracy in the modern world is associated with the following. It does not only usually bring political equality, but is a major channel through which not full, but some kind of social equality is also advanced. This is this is done through a process of establishing a welfare state and also allowing room for protest groups to claim public policies that would reduce the social inequalities brought about by the functioning of the capitalist market. In the kind of competitive authoritarianism capitalism I described, that is not possible. And yet one should not be as pessimistic. I believe most of the democracies of Europe today, East and West, have not started their backsliding towards the kind of non-democratic regime I have sketched for you, nor is it possible to argue that those regimes that have started going downhill have become competitive authoritarian regimes. What I think we have is, first of all, this slide away from popular sovereignty with worsening inequality, and that is inequality with regard to the distribution of income, the distribution of wealth, status inequality, by which I mean that, for example, young people who have the credentials to make a career are underemployed, thus they suffer from status inconsistency, and also we have other kinds of inequality particularly acute in the whole of Europe, such as gender inequality, and ethnic and racial inequality, which is also visible in Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe. This is the soil which is fertile for the other challenge against contemporary democracy in Europe. While one challenge is competitive authoritarianism, the other challenge, which is the last part of my discussion, my talk, is called populism. Populism by itself may not be undemocratic. Populism, as you know, claims that it is the real voice of the people, that the masses do not need an intermediary institution, such as political parties or labor unions, and that if they follow a certain leader, then they will be vindicated. This leader will take care of them. And in fact, the populist leader promises to the masses that if the populist party wins elections, then foreign elites or national, economic, and political elites will be pushed aside, and that the people will really rule. This is not actually the case. Wherever populist parties have won power, we see that some of the measures they apply are, first of all, measures which limit the space available for the opposition to function, the room available for democratic institutions such as the media, the justice system, independent authorities to play their own role, whereas at the same time these governing populist parties also implement what we call patronage or clientelistic policies, by which we mean that they recruit to the state only the supporters of their own party, or they hand out subsidies and tax breaks only to selected segments of the population. Thus, above all, this kind of populism is anti-pluralist, in the sense that populism is allergic, if not completely hostile, to any kind of opposition or criticism. And that holds for all kinds of populism, be it populism which seems left-wing because it espouses the claims of the weaker strata, or populism which is right-wing because it espouses perhaps nationalist feelings and racist feelings against migrants and refugees. It is, however, true that sometimes populists have asked the right questions. This is before they arrive in power. They have asked the questions why so much power is concentrated in the hands of business elites, or why elected leaders who are legitimately elected to govern do not listen to the people when it comes to policy shifts, and thus they apply, for example, austerity policies which are detrimental to the interests of the middle classes and the lower classes. So it is a good question to ask what can be done to make elected governing elites more accountable The wrong answer, of course, is to elect a populist leader, because this populist leader, along with the populist party, as I tried to argue, would probably constrain democratic institutions. Nevertheless, I think that the challenge of populism is overstated. We talk a lot about it in Europe today, and yet most European democracies are not governed by populists. The forthcoming European Parliament elections to take place on the 26th of May are elections in which, according to all opinion polls, will give the opportunity once more to center-right and center-left parties to have a majority of votes in the European Parliament. Populist parties have won representation in many European parliaments, from Northern Europe, for example, in Norway or Denmark, to Southern Europe and certainly in Eastern Europe, but they either govern in coalition with other parties, or in some cases they have lost votes. The last example is the decline, the electoral decline of the populist party Podemos in Spain only 2 days ago. And while another populist party in the same country, the Vox party, won votes and is now represented in parliament, and this is a right-wing populist party, overall one cannot say that in societies which have been hit by austerity, populism is on the rise. I would submit to you that populism is stagnant or it is declining. What I would like to argue then to finish this talk is that yes, there are large-scale challenges to democracy. Democracy is shaken, but I do not think that it is anywhere near a collapsing point. Competitive authoritarian regimes are very visible, and they are regimes, for example, in what used to be the former Soviet Union, and there are other competitive authoritarian regimes, for example, in contemporary Turkey, and yet, in Europe at least, you do not see such plain competitive authoritarian regimes. What you see is the rise of parties such as populist parties, which they may misbehave, if I can use this verb, in terms of the standard democratic practices. There is hope that while political elites have been delegitimized, democracy will again give the opportunity for Democrats of different variations to assume power again and to be able to fulfill a promise which democracy has not really been able to realize, that is, not only to offer political equality, but to give opportunities in order to reduce social, economic, ethnic, racial, and gender inequalities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dimitri. So we all learned some new things about our competitive authoritarian regimes from Dimitri's talk, and we also are now questioning populism as the main driver of this backslide. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to listen to our last speaker, Anna Ohanyan. Anna Ohanyan is the Richard B. Finnegan Distinguished Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Stonehill College. Her latest book is an edited volume from 2018, Russia Abroad, Driving Regional Fracture in Post-Communist Eurasia and Beyond. She has written for The Washington Post, Al Jazeera, and Foreign Policy magazine, among many other academic journals and media outlets. Tonight, Anna will bring our discussion to Armenia, a country that we are here to hear about because we are here for NAASR. So we are going to listen to Anna as she gives her talk, and she'll be sitting here. So let's give a hand to Anna.
Thank you very much, and I'm hoping that the microphone is working, so we don't have to project. I will continue actually where Dimitri left off, and Dimitri left off in a very important place. Two things that are very relevant in Dimitri's story as well as in Valerie's story. Number one, Russia does matter as to what's happening in Armenia's democratic transition and the chances of Armenia's democratic consolidation. And in regards to competitive authoritarian regimes, that is exactly what Armenia has exited from. So the story of competitive authoritarianism that Dimitri has described is extremely relevant as to what is happening and has been happening in Armenia. And I also appreciate, Dimitri, that you made a distinction between challenges that consolidated advanced democracies face in Europe versus more nascent democracies, challenge the procedural versus substantive. A democratic decline in Austria looks very different as to what's happening in some of the developing countries, more consolidated authoritarian countries. And at the same time, how do we think about what's happening in Algeria, what's happening in Sudan? How do these developments compare to Armenia's story? And how do we tell the story of a democratic decline around the world? So I do share your optimism, but I am also very worried as to what is happening worldwide. There is a great debate among policymakers, political analysts, and scholars as to what extent this current democratic decline worldwide is reversible. In general, democracies do come in waves, and after each wave, it have been coming in waves, we should say, and after each wave, they tend to be followed with a reversal, and the grand total usually always falls in favor of democracies. We always end up having more democracies in that wave than the backsliders. But the current backslide is definitely quite deep. Essentially, comparisons are taking us back to 1930s. As to why I'm worried about this particular democratic backsliding, democratic decline, is the globalization, which is the big story, and the previous speakers already alluded to it. The reason that the Western world is challenged with this is that there's massive increased inequality, not massive, but steadily increasing inequality in the Western world. People are often talk about Trump, worried about some of the things that President Trump is doing, but I always remind people that Trump and Sanders are two different sides of the same coin. They do respond. Both of them are anti-globalization in a way. They both speak to growing inequalities on the left and on the right, which is a challenge that democracies have to face. Inequality, automation is another challenge. I don't want to dwell on this too much. I want to get quickly to Armenia, just simply to say that there are some structural processes and developments that can challenge us to what's happening in Armenia. I will be drawing from a chapter that I'm doing on co-editing, actually, with Lawrence Browers of Chatham House. This is an edited volume on Armenia's Velvet Revolution, tentatively titled Armenia's Velvet Revolution, the Decline and Defeat of Competitive Authoritarianism in a Multipolar World. This will come out hopefully next year, if all of the chapter authors submit their chapters on time, which is always a challenge. But let me go back also to Mark's point. What is so special, what is so unique about what happened in Armenia? So on the one hand, we have all of these democratic declines that are happening, but also importantly, in terms of values, opinion polls show that the share of people in democratic states larger within the younger generation do justify authoritarianism. And Dimitri actually referred to it. So right-wing parties are on the rise, but what is happening in Armenia is that democratic values are prioritized. The social movement, the revolution that was unfolding in Armenia was a response to the high level of poverty and economic inequality, but there was a very solid theme that people wanted. It was about rights, it was about empowerment. And in that respect, considering that this was very much about values, does make Armenia's Velvet Revolution quite unique. And the fact that it was happening, unfolding within Russia's authoritarian orbit, with which Armenia has a security arrangement alliance, is also significant. And then hopefully we can talk about the Russian restraint, the event that did not happen, and what else are there any cards that Russia can play in derailing the process. And importantly, again, when we do talk about democratic declines, or democratic transitions, actually more specifically democratic transitions, it is important to consider where do these transitions are happening? What is the system that these countries are exiting, these systems are exiting? Are they exiting fully totalitarian, consolidated authoritarianism or soft authoritarianism, which was the case in Armenia? Now, in thinking about and writing this chapter, I very much tried to situate Armenia's Velvet Revolution within the academic context. I will not bore you with the theories that are relevant to thinking about Armenia's Velvet Revolution. I will allude to them very briefly. But basically, it boils down to the question as to why did it happen in Armenia? How was it possible, considering that Armenia was classified in Levitsky and Wei's book, actually, a very good book, as a stable, competitive authoritarianism, emphasis on stable, meaning that it was entrenched, the security apparatus was strong, political party was intertwined, or incumbent regime Republican Party was deeply intertwined with the coercive apparatus of the state, so things didn't look good. And importantly, Armenia, also in the same book, is credited with the following fact, that Armenia in all of the post-Soviet world has witnessed the largest share of political protest. So this sets up a very interesting paradox, right? On the one hand, you have stable, competitive authoritarian system, fully entrenched authoritarian regime, and you have people mobilized, and they come out in waves, and they keep trying, chipping away at the system, and it's not working. Then what made it different? That it worked not in 2017, even though there was not an effort, actually, that's a different story, but in 2018, not in 2008, not in previous years, not during Electric Yerevan, and not during Sasnatsaret. So there is a lot that Armenia offers to academics in thinking about possibilities of democratic transition, and importantly, exit strategies from competitive authoritarian systems. But I'll attend to it at the end. So what I did in this chapter, essentially, try to understand identity of the Velvet Revolution, and I've mentioned this in my prior talks, I will not repeat, but basically trying to see what is this looking, is the Velvet Revolution, does the Velvet Revolution looks more like a color revolution, which is not, and last time I said that velvet is not a color, that's the title of the chapter. How does it compare to the Arab Spring? How does it compare, and I haven't been even talking about more recent developments in Algeria and Sudan. But what I do find in my work that as academics we are guilty of giving geography too much power. Armenia has been analyzed within the post-Soviet context, perhaps too much, and the initial sort of the emphasis on color revolution overestimated the power of external actors. So in this respect, I argue in this chapter, and I've argued in some other writing, that Armenia's Velvet Revolution, democratic transition, actually I do not think it was a revolution, which is good that it was not a revolution, but that's a different question. But thank God it was not a revolution, because it unfolded within the stable, constitutional, even flawed, despite that it was flawed political order, and politically it was a lot more manageable than it would have been otherwise. But what I argue is that Armenia's democratic transition has a lot more in common with democratic transitions of Latin American countries in 1980s than it has with the color revolutions, more recent color revolutions in the post-Soviet world. And it does bring with it risks as well as opportunities in thinking about what to do next. So in very few, I argue, in going back to this question, is it the masses that matter? Is it the people power that determined the successful outcome? Or there's something going on with the regime itself? Or is it the people power? Is it the agency or the structure? Was it the high level of poverty that made this possible in Armenia? Was it the structure of the civil society? So these are some of the questions that I will break down into two arguments. Patterns of mass mobilization. Did it matter that Armenia's Velvet Revolution unfolded from bottom up, grassroots, very diverse, with women leading the way? Or the second variable that I will touch on is the stateness. the strong stateness, meaning the control of the government and the party of the society, which worked, actually provided a much needed cushion in a strange way for the revolution. I'll explain both in few words, and I'll try to remain within 10 minutes to leave time for Q&A. So in terms of the mass mobilization, because Armenia's Velvet Revolution was happening in a competitive authoritarian system, this system was more or less open in the past 10 years. It was a soft authoritarianism, media, there were sort of political, there was pretty vibrant civil society, and media, with state media was controlled by the government, but the internet was free. So because this was soft authoritarianism, competitive authoritarian systems, people constantly experimenting and voting in a ballot box, really working their skills of democratic muscles, all of those really played a role. This is in contrast to the Arab Spring. Arab Spring is useful to think about these transitions because in very repressive political systems leave very few avenues of political contestation. So when there is discontent, it usually comes in big waves without much civil society support. And that's problematic. And that was the challenge in the Arab Spring, while the outcomes were very different. Tunisia only consolidated, consolidated would be too strong of a word to say, but democratic transition is quite meaningful in Tunisia. This is in contrast to Libya, for example, or Syria. But Tunisia is also a country where the reformers that were leading the movement actually made alliances, very broad alliances, with religious parties as well. So while the outcomes in the Arab Spring were quite different, for a variety of reasons, the fact that they were facing deeply entrenched authoritarian systems, unlike Armenia, is important for our purposes. This is in contrast to Latin America, to which Armenia's transition resembles more. Here you had, again, similar to Armenia's very broad mass mobilization, from diverse groups. You had trade unions making alliances with victim groups, linkages and networks between them. And in the case of Armenia's civil society, this pattern of mass mobilization, what we have is grassroots, diverse, tested, nested, and networked social movement. Armenian civil society sometimes is criticized for being too donor-driven, that the NGO sector was not progressive enough. I disagree with some of this analysis simply because regardless whether the NGO sector, which is actually criticized for around the world, was too bureaucratic, too donor-driven, still, it did cultivate civic linkages. Democracy systems did deliver results, at least in a way that these NGOs formed the networks with much broader civil society organizations and volunteers that were bubbling up from the bottom. And it is this networked quality of the civil society that played an important role in making the democratic transition successful. I would like to cite actually a great report on this, the alliance between the two, from Armenian researchers that I have used, Jean Andreasyan, who I believe now is part of the government, if I'm not mistaken. Now, in terms of the stateness, and this is an argument that I'm still struggling to understand, one of the co-authors, actually, co-editor, just submitted a chapter on the elites, to how did the elites behave. The stateness, and this relates to the notion of stateness. Levitsky and Way, when describing and defining Armenia as a competitive authoritarian system, they did not envision that something like this could happen, but they did also say that the reason that Armenia's competitive authoritarian system was so consolidated is because the regime and the party apparatus were so organized. There was a strong security apparatus. The legacy of Armenia's war around Nagorno-Karabakh, so that played a role. It also strengthened the government's coercive power. And again, in a very strange way, that ability to maintain control over the society strengthened the institutional foundations of the state, and provided much needed, again, security blanket for Armenia, for the democratic transition that was happening. This is in sharp contrast to Georgia's Rose Revolution, where there were, and I'm citing, I want to say Jones or Chetarian, I have to look up, but basically the research shows that in the case of Georgia, the democratizers not only were trying to bring in democracy, these new values and institutions, but they also had to build the state. During the Rose Revolution, I mean, Shevardnadze was notorious. The core in the Georgian state was really weak. Some were describing nearing failed status. So state building was also a challenge in parallel to democratic transition. Armenia's Velvet Revolution did not face that challenge, fortunately, which contributed to its successful outcome. Another important argument that I'm finding in my work, and I have to admit, this is my favorite. I don't know why this is my favorite one, but you'll probably see. In the case of the Arab Spring, the reason that some of the authoritarian societies were so entrenched, some of these countries that were oil-rich rentier state, the governments were able to co-opt any civil society that existed. So any of the NGOs that formed were corporatists. They were incorporated into the government. They were working for the government in a way. In the case of Latin America, civil society, and the society was left for its devices. High level of poverty, inequality, some very real social and economic problems. People were not looking at the government for solution. They were trying to find solutions within the society. So what was happening in Armenia, very similar. The government did not have, while co-optation was a strategy by the government, but the government did lack, fortunately did not have oil, did not have any other resources with which could co-opt the NGOs and the civil society. And importantly, and this is the wild card, and I don't know whether you find this in your research or not, but I have not seen, I've been digging a lot, I have not been finding this. I think the diaspora played an important role. It was the wild card in how Armenia's democratic transition unfolded for the following reason. Diaspora, for years after Armenia became independent with the collapse of the Soviet Union, has been very active, quietly pouring resources into Armenia's economy, often driven by fixing specific problems. Assistance to children in this particular village, I don't know, this particular village needs a school, that school that particular village needs a hospital. So diaspora emerged in partnership with the local players in Armenia in addressing some of these very pressing social, socioeconomic problems. Wittingly or not, I think unwittingly, I'm not sure if there was a calculation on the side of diaspora to bring about democratic transition. My own research and conversations do show that diaspora, and most diasporans I speak to, they do not like to get involved into political life in Armenia, right? You don't have citizenship, you support as much as you can, you respect the state. But by becoming an important player in solving some of the social problems, diasporic organizations working with local civil society organizations help to maintain the independence of the society from the government. So this essentially made it very difficult for the government to co-opt and made it possible for the democratic transition to happen. And moving on and slowly finishing up, what I would like my colleagues in the academia to, why I would like them to look at Armenia for a variety of reasons. And again, Armenia is quite exciting in answering several questions. Number one, it showed an exit strategy from hybrid regimes. We know a whole lot as to what are the forces that contribute, drive, create hybrid regimes. But there's less research on what are the exit strategies from these hybrid regimes. In terms of the civic legacies, Armenia was criticized for its weakness of civil society, and as well Georgian civil society, all of the post-communist world was criticized, the Soviet legacies, and I'm a Soviet generation. Yes, I can attest to this. It was beaten out of us, the civic skills. But what Armenia is showing, and again, I've been reading a lot on some amazing scholarship on this, Armenia does have a very well-established legacy of civic engagement. Armenia's civil society predated its state. In political science, we analyze civil society relative to the state, right? Which is a very Western Eurocentric way of thinking about this. Armenia, and I'm sure many other states, younger states, they are used to self-organizing normally within imperial structures, whether it's Ottoman or Russian or Soviet, right? So Armenia's civil legacy, self-organization predated statehood, and that's something to consider very closely. Especially during the Soviet years, in 1960s, Armenia already experimented, had a case of civic mobilization around the genocide recognition, right? That it pressed the Soviet state for that. So the pattern of mobilization has been recurrent in Armenia while being interrupted now and then. But what I'm trying to argue is that simply stating that Armenia is a post-Soviet state that has Soviet legacies does not tell the story. It actually covers a lot more than answers. In terms of policy, I think Armenian case is very important in thinking about how to, and I'll conclude with this, how to respond to democratic transitions in similar cases of hybrid regimes, competitive authoritarianism. I might be a little harsh in my language, but I do think that American policy has this, what I call Goldilocks problem. American or the West, they either respond full force exporting democracy as you have in Iraq on the one end of the spectrum, and on the other end of the spectrum, when you do have genuine mass mobilization in the street, not a peep, right? Not a response. There has to be a middle, and I do think here, Armenia, as well as what's happening in Algeria and Sudan and several other cases, are leaving the Western world, a policy world in particular, in a little bit of a dead end, in a way that the Western world does not know yet what is the best move forward. And the reasons for that are various. And I will simply conclude that also Armenian case is important because this is happening in a fractured region. I'm referencing a book I just finished that Lisa mentioned. How do you build a democracy in a fractured region? How do you build a democracy in a region that is in between geopolitical systems, tearing it apart left and right? So I will stop here. I think my time is up, and I will turn this up to Lisa.
Thank you, Anna. So we brought it back to Armenia, and now we have so much to talk about, and I know you're all anxious to ask your questions. But I'm going to ask one question to our panelists, and feel free to chime in, any of you, at any point throughout the whole Q&A. So Sheldon Rowland has argued that democracy is a Janus-faced concept. Its participatory and radical demands for representation are often at odds with the state. And I quote, "The centralizing impulses of state makers are different from the emancipatory aims of genuine democrats." What advice do you have for Armenia as it reforms its political system? What advice do you have for Armenian citizens invested in democratic ideals?
I can get going. Sure. The quick one, I would say that what Armenia needs the most right now is its party politics. Fixing its party politics, strengthening its party politics, making sure that multi-party politics takes hold. While I'm very excited as to what has been happening, that mass mobilization, civil society is the force that played an important role, but at the same time, we do need the machine to start working, that until there's a transfer of power through the ballot box, no one can rest in Armenia. So I would say party politics that can tap into the existing energies that are in the streets right now. Civil society needs to remain mobilized, but party politics, multi-party politics is one that I would say is important.
Okay, great. I have thank you. My brief thought or piece of advice would be to just be very careful not to construct an executive branch heavy system. In other words, because the best predictor of failed democratic consolidation is super presidentialism, right? Is when you have an executive branch that has overweening power over the parliament. So if there's any reconstruction or redivision of power, that's what to look out for.
I would like to draw on experience regarding the construction of new democratic institutions on the one hand and the emergence of political parties on the other hand in the first stages of democratization. We have a dilemma. If, as experience shows, we allow political parties, the main protagonists of democratization, to compete amongst themselves and then, after one party wins power, to start constructing democratic institutions such as independent authorities, independent media, and so on and so forth, what happens is that the winner of elections, the party which has prevailed, is able to infiltrate and dominate all these different institutions. If, on the other hand, you first build these institutions, for example, a meritocratic bureaucracy, a justice system which is consisting of skilled judges, and so on and so forth, what may happen is the reverse. By the time elections are held, there will be in the way of parties which should be the protagonists of democracy, many stumbling blocks. These would be powerful bureaucracies, powerful justice systems, and so on and so forth. So, in my view, to make a long story short, there must be a very delicate balance and synchronization of building new institutions which are independent of strong political party influences, but also allow for the possibility that strong political parties emerge.
So that's great advice. Hopefully someone was taking notes and is going to be taking this information back. I think Hadwood might. So yes, there's a question up there.
So thank you guys so much for speaking on this panel. So the panel was ostensibly on Armenia, which being a former Soviet country, and this being the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, acutely brings up the question of Stalinism. And so I see it that partially the sort of recrudescence of the democratic and bourgeois revolutions that are similar in some sense in vein to the American French revolutions happening now in 2019 is to extinguish the sort of violations of such by Stalinism in the 20th century, the violation of liberal democratic rights, civil liberties. And so, but Stalinism historically in the earliest 20th century wasn't understood as such. It will only take the unfolding of the 20th century, at least partially through, to see Stalin, being a thug or whatever. But Stalinism saw itself as a variant of historical Marxism at some point in time, and so I was wondering if you guys could speak to your guys' understanding of the difference between the two and how the detachment of Stalinism from perhaps, say, orthodox Marxism has led to two situations in the present. The necessity of the sort of bourgeois liberal democratic revolution to fulfill the extinction of Stalinism in, say, former Soviet countries and in Europe, and also, say, the crisis of neoliberalism that's going on right now with the sort of shift
so
at
it
the
sounds
center
like
of...
your question, it sounds like your question is one about Stalinism and its kind of the inheritors of it in
Right.
in this region. If you guys want to comment on that.
I mean, I can being the Russia person on the panel. So it's an interesting thing, right? I mean, when you look at the authoritarian system in Russia now, it's legitimate to ask, how did we get here? Was it the fault of decisions made after the collapse of the Soviet Union? In other words, did people make the wrong choices? Were they selfish? Were they greedy? Were they power hungry? Or are there Soviet legacies that were hard to overcome? In other words, is there kind of like an inner Stalinism that was hard for the Russian regime to divest itself of? And, one of the things that we see now, right, is that when you look at public opinion surveys, Stalin is viewed with a sort of alarming positivity, right, in public opinion surveys in Russia now. He's seen as more, his rule was more positive than negative, more beneficial than not. And partly, I think partly what that's about is the victory over the Nazis in World War II, and Stalin got us through that, etc. But I do think that it's a challenge, right, for any regime that's been ruled by totalitarianism to try to extinguish those tendencies. And as I mentioned a moment ago, totalitarian regimes centralize power in a way that Russia has continued, in some ways, to keep reverting back to doing. So yeah, so it's still a live problem.
Okay, great. There's a question there.
Yeah. My question is why the Russians have let this happen. Because they're allergic to the color revolutions, they were frightened by it. Freedom House dates the democratic downturn to 2006. And yet Russia has worked against democratization in other post-Soviet places. Why is Armenia allowed to go tootling on toward democracy? What makes it
That's a very
more
important
tolerant?
question. It is the Russian restraint factor. I call it the Russian restraint. What are the reasons behind Russian restraint? Several explanations on this and more educated guesses. The author who is writing that chapter in the edited volume I mentioned, in his chapter he's arguing that because the decision-making is very centralized within the Kremlin, Putin just was not informed effectively that was happening in Armenia. He should have paid attention. He was distracted. That's one argument. But I don't think that's it. I think one explanation is that Russia already structurally has Armenia. Which I didn't use the word own, but structurally Russia has lots of systemic levers over Armenia, and Armenia is also one of the few countries where Russia still enjoys a lot of goodwill within the younger population. So it'd be foolish for Kremlin to do any military or any other form of direct intervention. And this is where people power is important. The revolution was driven by young people who did not live in Soviet years. So he had to be really careful about managing relations with this generation. And in general, the fact that you have, and people power is really critical here, that you have 150,000 people mobilized, it would be foolish, really. It just would not make sense for Russia to do anything in this case. The question, related question is, what are some of the next steps? Are there anything that Russia has in its toolbox? And here, I would argue that democratic transitions usually face the problem of authoritarian reserves, meaning when the authoritarian regime is removed, that regime does not disappear overnight and has lots of resources with which it can push back. Well, in the context of Armenia, some of those authoritarian reserves are concentrated within the media that are still controlled by the Republican Party, and the links between the media and Russia are also quite strong. And I don't have to explain, right? I don't have even to explain in the United States as to what are the tools that Russia can use in terms of fake news and the media instruments that it can use. And Armenia is still a small state and administratively not hold a lot of resources, so I don't think Armenia has a lot of instruments to push back if Russia decided to activate hybrid forms of warfare, like looting, going through the media, and this is something putting mildly. But again, I think Russia strategically has Russia. And one more point, researchers also, Russia watchers point out that Putin is not ideological player. I don't know what you think about this, Valerie. The argument being that as long as a particular regime is in good terms with Kremlin, even if that regime is democratic, Putin will let that be, which makes Nikol Pashinyan's strategy of making sure that the Velvet Revolution, as it was unfolding, remained free of any geopolitical coloring, a wise one, that Nikol Pashinyan was correct in making sure that this does not get described, pulled in as a color revolution or geopolitical revolution. So that's just a few points, but it's anybody's guess as to what's happening in the Kremlin right now.
There's a question right there.
Hi, I'm sorry to put Honor on the spot, but you are speaking to the subject a little bit more closely, so I do need to ask this. So I was fascinated because I didn't know much about the subject. You talked about civil society in Armenia actually being in place more even before the state, if I understood correctly, before the state was formed. So I was thinking, but then if that was the case, still the country became a competitive authoritarian state. So what does that bode for the future? I mean, there was civil society way before there was a state, but then
How did it become?
How did it become, and what does that say for the future?
You're right,
That's
right.
my question.
That's a very, very good point. When I do say civic legacies, I'm really speaking in terms of centuries. That it might have an effect, but it's a social science. It'd be very hard to show direct causation, to draw a direct line. For example, a constitutional assembly of the Armenian community in Ottoman Empire playing a role directly into the Velvet Revolution of today. It would be very difficult to do that. But I mean, I don't want to completely eliminate or discard the importance, the power of the Soviet legacies. I mean, the civil societies were demolished organizationally, and it took time to recreate them. So that would be one way to think about the lack.
There's a question up front.
Two questions. First, if we can agree, and I think you all did agree, that the stability of democracies is threatened increasingly by a bigger and bigger gap in income in income groups. How do you see the effect of climate change as being something that democracy will respond well to? Because the gap will only increase left alone. So that's question one. And the other question is, can you compare the strengths that you outline in civil society as supporting democracy in Armenia to the same question in Turkey?
What was the second part, Pamela?
Kind of
Civil
comparing
society
it
in
to
Armenia and
Turkey. Yeah.
How does it compare to Turkey?
Yeah, what's the setup in terms of the strengths that you mentioned that civil society embodies and supports democracy in Armenia? What does Turkey have that compares? How does it?
Thank you for these questions. I can only improvise to answer. The questions regarding climate change, which is already happening, obviously. We may see the following reaction, that is the rise of climate change refugees, people coming from parts of the world, not from Europe, but from other parts of the world, including Africa and South Asia, who would this time be abandoning their places of origin, not so much for political or economic reasons, but because their natural environment would not be sustainable, and that would increase a flow towards Europe. In that respect, I think one can predict that in the rest of this century, there will be a convergence of political, economic, and climate refugees who would naturally and unavoidably try to reach the shores of Europe, and Europe is not ready for this. European democracies have tried to indeed develop policies to address the migration crisis, even if that crisis did not deserve its name. I'm talking about the fact that only a small part of refugees and migrants have left Turkey, Jordan, and other countries to go to Europe, and Europe has not show itself to be up to the task of receiving small, rather comparatively small waves of migrants. And yet, these small, relatively small inflows of migrants have, as we have discussed tonight, increased the popularity of nationalist and racist movements. Imagine what would happen if larger inflows of migrants and refugees would try to reach Europe. Regarding civil society, one should look at civil society as something, I believe, that it is necessary for democracy, but it's not sufficient, by which I mean that there are dark sides of civil society. Some of the worst racist and nationalist groups have been nourished in civil society, not in the quarters of the government. There are, unfortunately, if you look at how modern authoritarian parties developed, there are some, let's say, enclaves in civil society consisting of self-organized groups which have mobilized and they have dispersed racist, nationalist and anti-democratic ideas. So civil society by itself is not a guarantee for better democracy. In the case of Turkey, as most of us know, the room for civil society to react to what is happening to that country has become smaller and smaller. It is very difficult to act in a society in which journalists, judges, civil servants, and even members of the security forces are apprehended just out of the blue. And as we speak, it is very difficult to find how it will be possible in the future for the European Union or the United States, on the one hand, to exercise some leverage over Turkey in order to bring about political change, while on the other hand, civil society rising from inside Turkey will be able also to push for further democratization.
Could I jump in on that very quickly? In terms of I have to admit, I've never thought about the climate change in this context, in the context of democratic transitions, but there is a scholarship studies on the link between climate change and conflict. That relationship is turning out to be quite complicated. I dived into that literature thinking that there has to be that environmental global climate change is going to exacerbate ongoing conflict, but right now the scholars are not set on this. It's very difficult to show the link simply because some of the effects of climate change are very local and societies vary in the extent to which they have local institutions to address the effects of climate change. So, but at the same time, I think what matters for countries like Armenia, it's the issue climate change will create a stress on the governance. So resilience is the word I would describe. So it becomes a question of governance as opposed to inequality. Inequality is already a very huge stressor for Armenia's democracy. So we'll see how the government is able to respond to that. And regardless whether that inequality is produced as a result of climate change or not. In regards to Turkey, I share all of the concerns that Dimitri faced. And obviously there has been massive, after the failed coup, I think the civic space already very limited in Turkey has been shrinking. Some of the Turkey watchers argue that if Turkey not developing a strong leftist parties is a major reason as to why strongmen like Erdogan succeeded. That the lack of strong leftist parties enable this authoritarian increase in Turkey. And it's the left parties that advocate for minorities. I would argue that Turkish nationalism has been very narrow, and that is, I think, is the crux of the issue. And which is really in the foundation of the Turkish Republic. If Turkey got the minority issues right from the beginning, Turkish democracy would have been in a much better place right now.
Okay, I think we have time for, let's say, 2 questions. Last 2. There's a question here. Yeah.
Thank you. And what is the role of social media in democratization, in building democracy? Because we saw that, for example, in Armenia, Facebook played a significant role, but there are scholars who argue that Facebook is a threat to democracy, especially in developed countries, considering the experience of the US recent elections. So I'm wondering, what are your views about that?
I'm not on social media, so please.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way you laid it out very nicely in your question. You know, it's a double-edged sword. Social media is an amazing organizing tool, and it was certainly very important during the Arab Spring. It's been important in Russia. You know, one of the reasons that there were these huge protests in December of 2011 after the parliamentary elections were that people were able to use their phones, you know, as a fully fledged recording studio right there in your hand, you know, to go into places, into polling places, and video camera, how people were filling out stacks of ballots for United Russia and flunking them into ballot boxes, and then they put that up on the web, right? So it's an amazing mobilizing tool, yet if in the wrong hands, I think also social media has contributed to kind of the dumbing down of, you know, of the population, where we don't know anymore how to establish the veracity of the things that we see. And I think because of that, in the wrong hands, it can be very easily used to manipulate people into following what maybe are not their best interests. You know, so that's fine.
Anyone else want to chime in, or we should take one more? Okay, let me see. Oh, man. There's a question back there.
Okay. I was just wondering, as a diaspora, we're quite influential. So what would you recommend that we do as a diaspora to promote the interventions that would favor what we think is the right path for Armenia? Because there's always the examples of diasporas that have had bad influence on the respective countries. So what would you recommend for us here as ways of, pushing, nudging, I guess would be the word, the direction we want for HISA?
Well, I can just say one thing. You know, we were talking earlier about Russia. I think if you were trying to lobby in the United States for the Trump administration to kind of do more to help Armenia and help the democratization movement, I think that could very easily backfire, because there's nothing easier in Russia right now than labeling undesirable phenomena as supported by foreign agents. Yeah. So I think it's actually an extremely dicey proposition about how foreigners can be of help really in any state, because any opposing party, the former authoritarian rulers in Armenia could easily say, oh, this liberal revolution, it's a Western phenomenon. It was created by the West. It isn't indigenous. I mean, it would be harder to argue in Armenia because 95% of the streets were filled, with protesters. But I still think it's important to be careful about that threat of any social movement being labeled not indigenous.
Sure.
I just want to say that I have mixed feelings about diasporas, because in the part of the world I come from, in the 19th century, diasporas built hospitals and schools, but in the end of the 20th century, diasporas organized and mobilized various groups of actually militia who participated in the Yugoslav wars. So I'm not decided not to do with the role of diaspora.
I tend to, I share all of those concerns, but I also think that diaspora is actually in political science, that's a rapidly growing research area. Diasporic communities are transnational advocacy groups. Again, not many would probably agree with me, but in general, I do believe that transnational advocacy groups, whether those are global NGOs pressuring for human rights in Latin America, which played an important role in democratic transitions in Latin America, or whether it's diasporic communities that mobilized here during the Velvet Revolution, I do think diasporic communities as transnational advocacy groups do play an important role. And of course, I'm thinking about Western diasporic communities which tend to support democracies. I don't know enough about the political values of diasporic communities, Armenian diasporic communities in Russia, for example. So that's my sort of tilted view on this. And in general, diasporic communities are the ones that actually pioneered, were the first investors in Chinese, in leading foreign direct investment in China that opened up China. So they're also important, can be, should be viewed as economic actors as well. So I tend to think that as to the basic level, actually Stefan and I were talking about this, and I am a diasporan. I'm raising kids who are diasporan. I do think diasporans should be actively engaged at the granular level in Armenia. While getting a dual citizenship if possible, trying to participate in voting, during Armenia's parliamentary the elections in order the 2017 that transitioned Armenia, changed Armenia's constitution from presidential to semi-presidential to parliamentary. Many diasporan Armenians from here actually did go to Armenia as election observers. While numbers might not have been really, really large, they're still significant. Qualitatively, that's an important activity. So I would say engagement, full engagement, but obviously the political locus of power is in Armenia. But supporting democratic transition, making sure that it does not derail, essentially. And it is, that's democratic declines are, we know, are definitely a player. And I'll just simply conclude and say that diasporans are also civil society. In any, you cannot have enough civil society in democratic settings where democracy is not consolidated.
Okay, on that very hopeful note, for all of us to stay vigilant, I think we can move our conversation upstairs or outside and conclude this evening's program. So we thank you for attending and hope that we will see you at future contemporary Armenian issues events with NAASR. Thank you.
Online. Այսպես ասենք the color revolution
If you guys like this event, feel free to follow us on social media. We Harvard Armenian Students Association. We have many things coming up. And thank you so much for coming.